Well, good morning. So good to be with you in this capacity. As Matt mentioned, my family and I are stakeholders here. So I'm not on staff here. I run a Bible organization here in Middle Tennessee, but my family and I have been part of Church of the City now for the last 8 years. And so grateful to be here in this capacity. And as Matt mentioned, we are continuing our series through Love One Another. And if you're just joining us today, all throughout the summer, we have been looking at phrases around something with one another. How do we, in essence, navigate life with one another? How do we love one another? How do we serve? How do we think about certain things? And I have the privilege this morning about talking about bearing with one another. Now, if you were here last week, you heard Darren's teaching on bearing one another's burdens. Okay, these are two very distinct teachings this morning. And if you were not here last week, I would highly encourage you to check out the teaching online. Darren did just a fantastic job of creating a very practical sermon around how do you know when and how to help someone who is in need. I know that my family and I just gained a lot from that and would encourage you to check that out for yourself as well. But we're going to be talking about bearing with one another, and this phrase only shows up in two places in the New Testament, both written by the Apostle Paul, both written around the same time in the early 60s of AD. Paul is awaiting trial before Nero and is writing from Rome, and he writes a few letters, and among those are Ephesians and Colossians, and this is where our phrase shows up. And as is our custom here at Church of the City, we stand in the honor of the reading of God's Word. So I invite you to do that if you can. And what I want to do this morning is I want us to read these passages aloud together. So let's begin with the Ephesians 4:2. Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. In the Colossians 3, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Thank you. So these are the two places where we have this phrase, bearing with one another. And in order to kind of get a sense for what's going on here, the word bearing in Greek is the word anekamenoi. And this is a word that means to put up with, bear, or endure someone when they wrong or annoy you. Essentially, like, how do you not like fly off the handle, right, when someone just ticks you off? Either you're angered by it, you're offended by it, or you're just like, this person is annoying and I am annoyed by their annoyance, right? It's basically kind of like an amplified form of patience. Now, when Pastor Sean kicked off this Love One Another series at the beginning of the summer, my family and I, we were sitting like right over here, and in the midst of his teaching, my wife leaned over to me and she said, hey, you're teaching in this series, right? And I was like, yeah. She goes, well, what are you talking on? And I said, bearing one another. And she goes, what does that mean? And I said, it's like an amplified form of patience. And she cracked up out loud. And she was like, oh, this is gonna be fun to listen to. So apparently I've got some work to do here, and which is always a good thing when you're a teacher. You're teaching people, but you're also teaching yourself in the process. But following that, just really began to, of course, dig into just this idea, especially because my wife thinks I need to grow in this area. What does this mean? What does this look like? And I came across a definition from a brilliant scholar that just unlocked some things for me. And I believe it'll do the same for you this morning as well. Andrew Lincoln said this about this phrase. Bearing with others means fully accepting them in their uniqueness, including their weaknesses and faults, and allowing them worth and space. Basically, how do you value someone to the level that you will be more patient with them, especially when you're inconvenienced by them in some way? And if you look into what Paul has done here, where this phrase shows up, it's right after he mentions the word patience. And as you go a little bit further back in these lists, you see that there is some common aspects between these two passages. Namely, notice how he begins the Ephesians 4:2, be completely humble and gentle, be patient. So you have humility, you've got gentleness, and you got patience. Notice the three before in Colossians 3 as well, before bearing one another. They're the same three. And I don't think that that's haphazard. I don't think that's random. Yes, he's writing these two letters around the same time, so maybe he's in a bit of a flow in thinking through this. But when you begin to look at how do you bear one another well, how do you value someone, I actually think for Paul, it begins with humility, and that is intentional. Now, I remember having a mentor who used to say to me all the time, he said, Brad, when you don't respond well to something, like that's the thing. But it's never about the thing. There's always a thing beneath the thing. And then sometimes there's like the thing, and there's the thing beneath the thing, but then there's a thing beneath the thing beneath the thing. All right, try saying that 10 times fast. And he said you have to get to the bottom thing before you're going to understand how the top thing is supposed to respond. And I think for Paul that if you were to say to him, okay, if you're talking about bear with one another, like what's the thing beneath the thing? He says, well, it begins with humility, but the adverse side of humility is what? It's pride. And I want to submit to you this morning that a root cause to why we don't often respond well to one another is actually rooted in pride. And I want to help us to understand this morning how Scripture talks about pride. What's the nature of pride? What is it doing so that we can be a little bit more attentive to how pride seeps into our lives? Now, let me just ask you this question. When was the last time that your pride got the best of you? And I'm talking about like the negative kind of pride. There's good pride, there's bad pride. Okay, there's good pride in maybe the school that you went to, or maybe one of your kids has been through a really hard season, but they're doing well and you're like, oh, I'm just so proud of them. Or driving onto campus and seeing the village and going, I'm so proud to be part of a church that doesn't exist just for itself. All right, there's good pride. I'm talking about the other kind of pride. That pride that gives us an inflated view of ourselves and then painfully drops us into some unwelcome places. Like, when has that pride gotten the best of you? I remember very clearly my freshman year of college. So I got to play 4 years of college basketball at a small college, Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And when I came on as a freshman, we had an amazing senior class. Like, I played probably 5 minutes a game, so my major contribution to the team was in practice. But we had an amazing senior class, arguably the best senior class we've ever had at the school. And as a basketball team, we were really good. The problem was we knew it. And halfway through the season, we'd been steamrolling teams, and we were playing our crosstown arch nemesis, and we showed up to the game thinking that we could just show up. And it was an ugly game. Not for them. We made them look like the Harlem Globetrotters that game. We were just abysmal. We didn't have any gumption. We weren't diving on loose balls. We weren't boxing out. We weren't communicating. We were missing layups. Like, at the end of the game, we had been decimated and embarrassed in front of thousands of people. And we were all dreading the next practice because we knew what was coming. And the very next day we had practice, and about an hour before the practice started, the power got knocked out and there was no power on campus. Some of you maybe in the last 25 years have been to Grand Rapids, have been to Cornerstone University, has arguably one of the best small college basketball arenas in the United States, lots of natural light. That was being built during my freshman year. The gym we were in had no natural light. It was like a Cracker Jack box. And I tell you that because with no power, we were thinking, well, surely there's no practice. There's no light whatsoever. And yet we didn't get notified that we didn't have practice. And we were smart enough to show up. And so we got all stretched out. And in the gym, the only light were like the light being emitted from the exit signs. And we thought, you can't even see the baskets. There's no shooting. Like any passing drill, somebody will probably break a nose. We're not doing that. Like, why are we here? And as we're discussing this among one another, the door opens in the back side of the gym, and our coach comes walking in. And it didn't matter how dark that gym was. It did not mask his anger. And he just walked the length of the floor, came to us, and he got right in front of us, and he just simply said this: we don't need baskets and balls to do what we're going to do today. Get on the baseline. I wanted to cry, all right? And I wasn't the only one. There is no way we could have predicted how much we were going to run that practice. I mean, we ran and we ran and we ran till we couldn't even stand. And when we are literally on the ground, he walks up to us and he says, you can't just show up. And he walked out of the gym. Practice over. It was horrific and it was memorable. And that was the point. Because he reminded us in that moment that pride was an unwelcomed visitor on our team. Like, when has that kind of pride gotten the best of you? Maybe you had a significant test or exam and you didn't really put in the work because you thought, well, I'll just be able to pass this, and you didn't. Or maybe you were helping someone move and they said, hey, will you help me pick up this desk? And in your mind, you're going, that looks heavier than what I'm capable of, but I can't tell them that. So you threw out your back. Right? Or maybe it was something really painful where you were in a leadership position and you just had this mindset, yeah, those rules don't apply to me. And those rules caught up to you. Like, it's in these moments where we are reminded of the often quoted axiom, pride goes before a fall. Yeah. Did you know that that doesn't just show up in a fortune cookie? That's actually in the wisdom tradition of the book of Proverbs. A passage many of you know well, at least by distillation. The full passage is, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And this is what we just call a parallelism. It's the same thing being said two different ways. So the first line and the second line match, and that's why over time it just got truncated to pride goes before a fall. Now, if we just break down this first line, the word pride and the word destruction, it actually helps us significantly understand the nature of pride, because the original language of Hebrew in many cases is very visual with its language, which is helpful for me who is a visual person. Now, when it comes to the word pride, in Hebrew, it's the word gaon. Let me hear you say gaon. Gaon comes from the Hebrew verb ga'ah, which means to be high or to be tall. So gaon means pride, but more emphatically, it means to be high, to be tall, or to be majestic. You could say majestic in our own eyes. So the word picture here is that what pride does is it gives us this inflated view of ourselves. It makes us want to be high and tall, rising above everyone and everything that is beneath us. Now, the word destruction is the word shever. Let me hear you say shever. And shever just means a breaking. So the picture here is that in our height, we become so tall, so high, so majestic, that we get so tall that we cannot sustain ourselves, and we snap and we break and everything comes crashing down. Do you think of it in these ways? How many of you remember playing with wooden blocks when you were growing up? Okay, how many of you had them for your kids? Yeah. You have like a box of wooden blocks and you dump them out onto the ground. What's the first thing a child wants to do with those blocks? Yeah, stack them up, build a tower. All right, this is what my kids would do. This is a photo I took a number of years ago. They want to see how high can they build a tower. And so they get like 3 or 4 pieces in, and if you're down on the ground with them, you see that they're not lining up. What do? You help them, right? You shore them up because you want to give them the best chance at building the biggest tower. But it doesn't matter how tight those seams are. At about block 8, 9, 10, 11, the whole thing starts to sway. And there's a moment where the height cannot sustain itself, and it just takes one thing, block goes, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. That's the nature of pride. And it's why we have statements like, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Yes. But here's the thing that's interesting about pride, is that pride's goal isn't just about making us big or tall. That's actually only a means to an end. Pride's goal is actually gaps. It wasn't just that we had a high view of ourselves during my freshman year playing our arch nemesis. It was that we saw ourselves here and we saw our arch nemesis down here. Meaning there was enough of a gap that if we didn't play well, we'd be able to still pull it out. If we saw ourselves up here, which we did, and we saw our rival here as well, we would have approached that game very differently. But our pride wanted us to believe that there was a gap, because that's how pride works. It's oftentimes in terms of how we see ourselves versus how we see someone else. This is why if someone has a high view of themselves and they see someone else down here, that if this person starts to get higher, this person will often say something derogatory or negative to this person, and we will say things like, oh, they took their legs out from underneath them. Meaning what? They tried to drop them to size. Because in our pride, we create gaps, and our pride will do whatever it can to maintain or increase those gaps. And the moment we perceive that and that gap starts to close, we react. And by the way, this is why oftentimes you'll have managers who are sitting here in an organization and they've got someone beneath them in the organization. And oftentimes these managers will not invest in those who are below them, because if you give them the skill set that starts to rise up to you, you put yourself on the chopping block and you go, I need to make sure that I stay important in the organization. It's oftentimes why succession plans fail miserably, because the founder or the leader doesn't really give the one coming in everything they need, because in kind of a prideful, arrogant way, if things don't go as well as they did under the founder, it's the founder's way of reminding everyone, look how great I was. Because our pride wants to create those gaps. It's not only just how we see ourselves versus others, it's also gaps in perception versus reality. Think about, we've probably all had this happen, maybe in some level. Someone we're talking to and they say, hey, I just want to let you know that we're getting a divorce. And as a friend, hearing this from another friend, you're like, okay, I know things are tough and I know marriages go through hard seasons, but what? And then the friend starts sharing with the other friend about what's been really going on for the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And we're just taken back by this because we thought everything was okay. Well, that couple wanted you to believe that they were doing this. The perception is here. The reality at home, it's very different, and there's a gap. And oftentimes what happens is whether it is a couple that is struggling, or think about maybe you're struggling with something, an addiction of some sort, and nobody knows. There's this sense of you want people to believe that you have it all together, but the reality is you are struggling, but your pride says nobody needs to know, or worse, you have the strength or the intellect to figure out how you're going to beat this. And you get stuck because in your pride, wanting a gap, you don't actually bring someone in that can help you to deal with that thing that is going on inside of you. Now, let me be clear. If your marriage is struggling or if you're individually struggling with something, it's not that people need to know. It's that the right people need to know. And oftentimes your pride will want to make you believe that you can figure it out or someone else doesn't have to know. And that's where pride just gets really dangerous and lethal. Because we think the gaps we create are our stability, but they actually become our greatest vulnerability. And when it comes to this idea and realization that pride goes before a fall, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so the question becomes, as we identify these gaps in our own life, as we see the negative side of pride, entering into our story, the question becomes, well, what do we do? What do we do, whether it's a gap in perception and reality, or even just a gap in how we see ourselves versus other people? Because this is one of the things that I think about often and have to check myself on a regular basis, is when you meet someone, typically one of the earlier questions you're going to ask is, what do you do? And the question that I think we all have to do is in those moments is ask ourselves, why am I asking this question? Is it for the purpose of wanting to understand more of just what their gifts and their passions are and what they get to do in order to value them at a deeper level because I know something more about them? Or what oftentimes happens in our pride is that we ask these questions in order to figure out, where does this person rank in light of me? That if you meet someone and you see yourself here and they're here, we often use the language of, oh, I'm sizing them up. I want to know, where do they sit? And what can happen is that you can meet someone, and if they're up here, then you begin to go, oh, what can I do to have them up here help me do this? And we start not valuing them for who they are, but in what they can do for us. Or we see ourselves here, and then you start talking to someone and you kind of subtly go, yeah, they're kind of like down here. Then you start scanning the room for the next person you want to go meet. It's deadly. Absolutely deadly. So how do we navigate this? Well, written alongside of Ephesians and Colossians is another prison letter that Paul wrote to the Philippian church. And in it, he includes something that is a very well-known passage, but I want you to hear it now in light of the conversation this morning. So notice here, Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. See that language of height there? Paul is talking about humility, which, just very basically, humility means to get low. So if pride means to get tall, then humility means to get low. But again, it's not just about, well, I'm thinking highly about myself and now I need to get low. It's about, how do we close the gap between how we see ourselves and how we see someone else? And Paul says, listen, do nothing out of selfish ambition. or vain conceit. It's not about you. It's how do you interact with people where you value them. And it's not for Paul just closing the gap. He goes so far as to say that you actually see everybody in a way where they're actually above you. You value them more than you even value your own status. And I love this. And he just continues, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. And then Paul says, let me give you an example. He goes on, he says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Paul's like, I'm commanding you to do something, but let's just for a moment be reminded of what Jesus did for us. The one who had every right to be high and lifted up, not only humbled himself, lowered himself by entering into human space and time, but didn't even come as a conquering king or conquering royalty. Like he came as a servant, that he was humble within the humility of which he even entered into our story in order to value us enough to die on our behalf. And Paul said, that's what we're talking about. How do you value people to that level? And if we go back to this definition we started with, that bearing with others means fully accepting them in their uniqueness, including their weaknesses and faults, and allowing them worth and space. That if we value one another in that way, then in the list of what Paul is giving us to do, if we begin with a sense of humility, then we will be more gentle with one another. We will be more patient with one another. We will be more grace-filled with one another because we value them at a deeper level. And so part of what this is just being aware in which pride exists in our own stories, but it's also helpful to be cognizant of how pride exists within the power dynamics of our world today. I was reminded of this a number of years ago. Before we moved down here to Middle Tennessee, my family and I were in West Michigan, and I was a teaching pastor for a church very similar to Church of the City. And I would regularly meet with people, as pastors do. And in my office at the church, when you walked into my office in the corner, I had 4 chairs. And they sat in a cross-shaped pattern where I'd have 2 chairs here and I have 2 chairs here, and they were in the corner. And inevitably, when I had someone come into my office, they would always ask me, where do you want me to sit? And my response was, wherever you want. And on one particular occasion, this guy came in and he sat in this chair, and I had these 2 chairs and this chair as are my options. And so I sat here right across from him, and the first words out of his mouth were, oh, this is going to be a confrontational conversation, huh? I was like, what? He says, you've got something hard to talk with me about, and this is going to be confrontational. And I said, I actually don't have anything confrontational to talk with you about. I just want to have a conversation. And he goes, well, that's not what you communicated by sitting in the chair directly opposite of me. Now, I wanted to say, like, dude, chill out, man. I was just looking for a chair, okay? There's nothing going on here. And I kind of blew it off. And after he left, like, I sat with that for a while. And I was like, oh, like just the very structure of my office already put a power dynamic into my favor. It's my office. I'm a pastor here. You're entering into my space. And then out of all the chairs that I could have chosen, I sat right across from him. Now, I'd had conversations with lots of people for years before any of this came up, but it was in that moment where I was like, I have to be very careful about entering into the power dynamics that our world has, being unaware of what that does to someone who already feels inferior walking into my space in this way. And so going forward, whenever anybody came into my office to meet with me, I still had the same setup. I had, 2 chairs this way, and they would walk in and they would say, "Where do you want me to sit?" And I was like, "Wherever you want." And if they sat down, I always chose one of the chairs on either side so that just even in my body posture, they would see this is with, not against. And I think one of the things is that the world plays out power dynamics in such a way that we've just fallen into that structure, not even necessarily knowing that we have been promoting a structure that is actually not truly valuing people to the level like Jesus did. And so, for me, even to this day, if you walk into my home office, I don't have 4 chairs anymore. I don't usually meet with that many people in my home office. I've got 2 chairs and they're positioned just like this. By the way, it's really awkward to have them side by side like this because then you get a kink in your neck, But just being enough on an angle would let this person know, hey, we're having a with conversation. And even as I continued as a pastor at the church that I was at, when I did have to have hard conversations, confrontational conversations, because that happens in leadership, it was still from a perspective of, I value you enough to have a heart-to-heart conversation. And the question just becomes for us is how often do we not realize that our pride seeks to maintain a power dynamic that puts people in an inferior position? And how can we tweak the environment? How can we tweak even the language we say? How do we tweak even our own perception of one another in such a way that we value others above ourselves? Because this doesn't happen just in corporate America. This happens in our marriages. This happens in our relationship with our kids. This happens in our friendships. It's how do we position this in a way that values the other person? Now, I'm not saying like on an org chart, you get everybody on a flat line. That's not the case. It's that as a leader, how do you instill in those who report to you that you value them in such a way that anytime that you sit down to have a conversation, it's like you are sitting on the same level? How do we close these gaps in our lives? Because that's what the call is here. It's how do we take these gaps that pride has created and how do we close the gaps? And how we see ourselves with one another, to close the gap between perception and reality, but also how to close the gap in just structures that may have been in place for a very long time, but they're not as healthy as they could be. And I believe if we can do that and elevate the worth of those that we interact with, we will be more patient. We will be more gentle. Now, they still may annoy us from time to time because some people are just challenging, right? EGR, extra grace required. But here's what I want to challenge you with, is that when people upset you, annoy you, frustrate you in some way, and you have like a visceral reaction, what we typically do is to think in our minds, first and foremost, like, what is wrong with them? You know what a better question to ask is? What is wrong with me? that response is coming from somewhere. That trigger is coming from somewhere. And oftentimes what we don't like in one another is what we don't like in ourselves. And that oftentimes we don't do the thing beneath the thing beneath the thing in order to figure out, God, why did I respond that way? Like, what is it about that I need to pay attention to, that I need to invite you into in order to deal with whatever's going on here? Because that triggered something that's here. And so we seek to close the gaps. But we don't do it haphazardly. I would take this and I would go, close the gaps emphatically. Because pride is way more toxic than we can possibly imagine. Our basketball team that year would go on to win the NAIA National Championship. We had never made it to the national tournament, and we obviously made it in the national tournament. We got to the championship game. We won in overtime on a last-second call against my wife's alma mater that I love to remind her of. And if you've ever been a part of a championship team, you know that it's never one thing. It's a lot of things that have to go right to be the last one standing. But when I look back on my freshman year, and I think about what was the catalyst moment that enabled us to do that, it was that practice. It was that awful and horrific practice where our coach took drastic measures to ensure our pride wouldn't take us out again. And I want to encourage all of us to think through, wherever we see those gaps in our lives, God, what drastic measures do I need to take? Because when it comes to pride, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And if we can close the gaps now, our pride won't get the best of us. One of the things that I love about our rhythm here on a weekly basis at Church of the City is that we engage in a time of communion. And if you're just visiting, you'll notice down to the sides of your chairs are the communion elements. And I want you to just hold on to those for a few moments. And I want to encourage you sometime today, sometime this week, to just write down, like, God, where are the gaps in my life? And to go deeper with some of these things. But for now, I just want to give us a minute just to sit and contemplate, God, where is pride manifesting itself in my life? And what am I going to do about it? And as you hold on to those communion elements, and as we have this time, we don't engage in this process alone. We ask the living God of the universe to meet us in these moments. Because as Paul reminded us in Philippians 2, he humbled himself even to the point of death on a cross. And then Paul goes on and he says this, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. We don't just come to the one who humbled himself to die on our behalf. We also come to the one who rules and reigns supreme, who holds all power, who has all knowledge, and is wanting to partner with us and to join us in helping us to become the disciples of his that we long to be and he wants us to be. And so as you identify these gaps and you're asking the question, God, what do you want me to do? Just say, Jesus, give me the courage and the capacity to walk this out. So God, we come to you together as a community this morning to say thank you for the opportunity that we have to engage your living, breathing word. God, as we identify these gaps in our lives, would you just give us the courage and the capacity to close the gaps, to take whatever measures are necessary to ensure that humility reigns supreme in our souls. Jesus, thank you for humbling yourself, for entering into our space to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. And we thank you that through your Spirit, you empower us to be like you in the world today. So give us the ability to value others like you value them. That may we see people with your eyes, and that in our relationships with one another, that we would put you on display for the world to see what you are like. Jesus, we love you, we bless you, we thank you. And everyone said, amen.